The shocking family betrayal. How my father tried to steal my house. Mark had always been the hard-working one in the family. And for a long time, he'd watched his older sister, Sarah, get everything handed to her. While he saved up for years to buy his first home, a cozy 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, Sarah never seemed to have to work for anything. She was the one who received all the attention, all the support, and all the perks. Their parents, John and Lisa, had always treated her as the golden child. She'd received a house from them, a beautiful 3-bedroom place in a nice neighborhood. But rather than appreciate it, she sold it within a year, squandering the money on failed business ventures and impulsive spending. And after that, she relied on their parents for everything, never lifting a finger to make her own way in the world. Mark didn't mind at first. After all, it wasn't his problem if Sarah wasn't responsible with her finances. But he couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. While he worked his butt off, saving every penny, keeping his head down, and putting in the time to build something real, Sarah coasted through life without a care in the world. He'd always been the one to step up, the one who sacrificed for the family. But in return, he got nothing. When Mark finally bought his house, it felt like a huge accomplishment. It wasn't a mansion, but it was his. He was proud of it, proud that he'd done it all on his own. No handouts, no favors, no free rides. He had earned every inch of that house, every square foot of the place that he'd worked tirelessly to afford. For the first time, he felt like he could say, "This is mine," and he had no idea that his family, his own father, would eventually try to take it all away. When Mark's dad called him and asked if he could visit, Mark had no idea what was coming. He certainly didn't expect Sarah to show up too. They all sat down in his living room, exchanged pleasantries. But then the bombshell was dropped. His father, without hesitation, demanded that Mark give up his house for Sarah. The house that he had worked so hard for. The house that was his. The house that marked the first step toward independence. And just like that, Mark's world was about to change forever. Mark was stunned. The nerve of his father and Sarah left him speechless for a moment. He had worked tirelessly for years to get to where he was, saving up every penny, building his life from scratch, and finally buying his first home. And now, his father was sitting there, asking him to give it up for Sarah. His father's argument was weak at best. "Sarah needs it more than you do," he said, like it was that simple. But Mark knew better. Sarah didn't need a house. She didn't need anything from him. She needed to face the consequences of her actions. Mark's anger bubbled to the surface. His father and Sarah had never truly understood the struggle he went through. Sarah had squandered a house their parents gave her and had been living off them ever since. And now, when she was out of options, they were asking him to sacrifice everything he'd worked for. For Sarah, who hadn't even tried to help herself. It was absurd. Mark's voice was calm but heavy with frustration as he shot back, "No, absolutely not." His father's face turned red with anger. But Sarah just sat there, arms crossed, a smug look on her face as if she'd already won. "You're being selfish," she sneered. "That house was a gift from Mom and Dad. You can't just take it and keep it all for yourself." The words hit Mark like a slap to the face. A gift? Sarah had sold her gift, wasted it, and now she was trying to claim something that wasn't hers. Mark stood up, walking over to his office and opening his filing cabinet. He grabbed a folder, walked back into the room, and dropped the paperwork on the table in front of them. "Go ahead," he said, his voice unwavering. "Cut me out of the will. But don't forget, Sarah has already gotten her share." He slid the deed to the house across the table, revealing it was his name on the title. His father's face went from red to ghost white. Silence filled the room. Mark had had enough. He wasn't going to let them manipulate him anymore. This wasn't just about the house, it was about respect. About standing up for himself after years of being overlooked. It was a fight for his independence, for his future. And he wasn't backing down. As the days passed after the confrontation, Mark thought it was over. He had stood his ground, told his father and Sarah exactly where he stood, and shut the door on their entitled demands. He was ready to move on. But he should have known better. Family drama didn't just disappear. A few days later, the call came. His realtor was confused, asking why his father had inquired about the ownership of his house. Mark's heart sank. He couldn't believe it. Why would his father even need to know that? His mind raced, and everything fell into place. They weren't done with him. Mark had shut them out once, but now they were trying to find a way back in. His stomach churned with anger. He rushed home, determined to confront whatever his father was plotting this time. As he pulled up to his house, a sinking feeling took over. The sight of his father and Sarah standing on his porch with a locksmith confirmed his worst fears. They weren't just trying to manipulate him anymore, they were taking it to the next level. Mark's blood boiled as he recognized what was happening. His father was attempting to break into his home, with Sarah smugly standing by. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about control. This was about his father trying to take back what he thought was his by right. Without hesitation, Mark turned on the security camera and spoke through the microphone. "Can I help you?" The locksmith jumped back in shock, realizing he had been caught. Mark glared at his father, who wasn't even fazed. "We're just checking something," his father said nonchalantly. But Mark wasn't buying it. He demanded to know what exactly they were doing. The locksmith hesitated, trying to cover for them. But Mark could see through the lies. "You don't live here," he snapped. "And you sure as hell don't own this house." Mark's pulse raced. But he didn't flinch. He pulled out the deed to the house and showed the locksmith proof of ownership. His father was left speechless, his face turning red with anger and shame. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, thinking she could get away with it. "You can't do this," she spat. But Mark wasn't having it. "I've got all the proof I need," he said, calm and collected. "And if you try this again, you'll regret it." As his father and Sarah fled, Mark stood there, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. This wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about the final stand. He wasn't just protecting his home. He was reclaiming his power, refusing to let them walk all over him anymore. And he knew the battle wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. Days had passed since Mark stood his ground, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through his veins. He thought the worst was behind him. But then came the unexpected twist: his father wasn't finished. It started with a strange call from his lawyer. And then the real shock came. Mark found out that not only was his father trying to take back his house, but he was also making moves to change his will. The same man who had tried to manipulate him, to take his hard-earned home, was now planning to disinherit him entirely. Mark's blood ran cold. He had already been prepared for the worst. But this was a whole new level of betrayal. The idea of his father changing the will, after all the years of neglect and favoritism, made Mark's stomach turn. His hands clenched into fists as he processed the news. Was it really possible that after everything, his father still thought he could control him? But Mark wasn't about to let it slide. Not this time. He'd fought for everything he had. And now he had something his father couldn't take away, not without a fight. Mark had his own lawyer. Someone who understood the weight of this kind of family drama. With a quick call, he learned that his best option was to move fast. They needed to act before his father could change the will. Mark wasn't going to let his father play him like a pawn any longer. He would have to face the consequences of his own actions, and this time, Mark would make sure there was a record of it. Determined to protect his future, Mark took the necessary steps. He filed papers to protect his inheritance, making sure his father's attempts to cut him out would be thwarted. As he walked through the process, he couldn't help but feel a sense of power growing within him. This wasn't just about protecting his house anymore, it was about ensuring that he would never be manipulated again. That night, Mark's phone rang again. It was his father. Without hesitation, Mark picked up, his voice calm but firm. "I know what you're trying to do. And I won't let you take what I've worked for." His father's voice came through the phone, defensive and angry. But Mark didn't care. The fight wasn't over yet. This time, he wasn't backing down. He'd made his stand, and he wasn't about to let his father take control again. Mark's resolve only strengthened after he took the necessary legal steps to secure his future. It was clear now, his father wasn't just trying to control his home. He was attempting to ruin everything Mark had fought for. The fight had escalated beyond inheritance or property. It was a matter of dignity, respect, and the power to finally stand on his own 2 feet. Days passed in tense silence. Mark stayed on edge, always checking his phone, his mind racing with possibilities of what his father might do next. Then, the confrontation Mark had been bracing for came when he least expected it. One evening, he saw a familiar car pull into his driveway. The unmistakable silhouette of his father, the same man who had torn apart their relationship, got out of the car. Mark's heart raced, but he was ready. He opened the door just as his father stepped onto the porch, his eyes filled with anger and resentment. Mark didn't flinch. "I'm here to settle this," his father spat, his voice venomous. "You think you've won? You're just being foolish." "No, Dad. I'm not foolish," Mark replied, his voice steady, his anger well controlled. "I'm protecting myself, something you never taught me to do. You've been trying to take what's mine for far too long. You can't just walk in here and expect me to hand it over to you." His father's face turned an unhealthy shade of red as he took a step toward Mark. "You ungrateful brat. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" "Everything you've done?" Mark scoffed, taking a step forward himself. "You've spent my whole life handing things to Emily, and I've been expected to just accept it. I've been the backup plan, Dad. The second choice. But not anymore." There was a pause. His father's eyes darted around, searching for a way to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. Mark's words had hit their mark. "I've built my life on my own," Mark continued, his voice gaining strength. "I don't need you, and I sure as hell don't need your manipulations. I've already protected myself legally, and there's no way you can change what's coming." Mark's father looked like he was about to shout again. But Mark raised a hand. "Don't bother," he said, his tone final. "I'm not afraid anymore. This ends now. You don't get to control me, not now, not ever again." With that, he stepped back, locking the door behind him. The finality of the moment settled in as Mark leaned against the door. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Free from the manipulation, free from the lies, and free from the toxic control that had shaped his existence for so long. He had one.